Welcome to Caregiver Cast with Mary Elaine Petrucci. Are you overwhelmed raising a family, working full-time, caring for a parent or grandparent? It can be challenging when you're doing it alone. Caregiver Cast helps busy, burned-out professionals reduce their stress and overwhelm to create a better caregiving experience for themselves and their loved one. Caregiver Cast brings caregivers together with experts who provide information in a variety of areas. In each episode, you'll get tips on topics such as finance, legal, medical, self-care, community resources, mindset, and more. We're here to make your caregiving journey a more rewarding one. Acquire the confidence and skills to be a more capable caregiver by implementing the resources and strategies from these expert thought leaders. Get a community of support, resources, and strategies for your caregiving journey inside the Caregiver Lifeline community. Visit caregiverlifelinecommunity.com. And now here's your host, Mary Elaine Petrucci.
Hi, welcome to Caregiver Cast. My name is Mary Elaine Petrucci. My special guest today is Mandi Freger, who is a psychologist who will be talking to us about From Exhausted to Energized, the Autism Spectrum Disorder Caregiver's Guide today. So to let us know what's involved if you are raising a child with autism spectrum disorder. Before I formally introduce Mandi to Caregiver Cast, I'd just like to tell you some information about her. Throughout her career, Mandi has served in multiple roles within many service lines of behavioral health treatment, including acting as a supervisor in both outpatient and residential settings, and providing decades of psychotherapeutic treatment to various populations. She has gained extensive experience with those with autism spectrum disorder. Mandi was one of the initial candidates to obtain the behavioral specialist license, as well as status as a certified trainer in functional behavioral assessment in Pennsylvania, with an emphasis on autism spectrum disorder treatment planning. She's also a licensed professional counselor in Pennsylvania. Mandi was the first director of autism services within an affiliation agreement with Cleveland Clinic's Children's Hospital to bring its model of autism services to southwestern Pennsylvania, which included overseeing a licensed private school and a diagnostic center. Originally trained in energy psychology techniques such as EMDR and TFT to treat trauma, mood and pain disorders, and learning challenges, Mandi has been using a variety of energy-based modalities with children, adolescents, adults, and staff. Mandi is a former board member and education chair for the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology and holds diplomat status in comprehensive energy psychology. Mandi also works with athletes to advocate for effective mental health practices while utilizing energy psychology tools to address trauma, injury management, and clinical barriers to peak performance. In her free time, Mandi is passionate about fitness and is a group fitness indoor cycling instructor. Mandi holds a basic certificate in integrative and functional medicine through IFM. Welcome, Mandi, to Caregiver Cast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I know I've worked with a lot of children with autism spectrum disorder, so they could be from nonverbal to high functioning, or those in between who have behavior problems. So I'm familiar with those functional behavioral assessments. So kudos to you for obtaining all those licensures, because it is a very challenging population to work with, but also a very rewarding one, I found, as a speech language pathologist. So as a caregiver, you have a parent with a child who has autism spectrum disorder. Explain the kind of stress parents are going through when they have a child with so many needs.
Well, I think that the general public can probably relate to this in today's world because the stressors in general for people have been very high in the
Hmm.
past few years, and especially for parents and all the changes with the kids have gone through in the past few years with school and integrating back into the community or being at home. But for this subpopulation of parents who are and guardians who are parenting kids with ASD, my mission today is to talk to your audience so that they understand that there's a little bit more of a chronic intensity to this population's stress because of the high demands and the behavioral demands that the kids have, with this diagnosis. I'm not going to talk a lot about the diagnosis, but in general, a lot of these kids tend to be very sensitive or medically fragile. I think
Mm,
this is a good place to start because I don't think the majority of the population really understands this aspect of this disorder. So, autism spectrum disorder is a neurological disorder as a basis. So, I say to people, it stands to reason that when something comes into the body, whether it's a food or a substance, that brain has a tendency to potentially metabolize something different because the brain is different.
mm,
So see a lot of these different types of sensitivities or rigidities on the other end of the spectrum with this population. So just keeping up with diets, with food concerns, working around the child is what young parents tend to start to do early on because of preferences. But as they get into treatments and find the right physicians, there's a lot of dietary sort of regulations that are individualized for the child depending on the physician. And a lot of people will hear about, I think the most common thing is like kids are gluten free, they're dairy
mm,
free, those types of things. But that in itself, I just want to point out to parents that if parents that are listening to this today who do not have a child diagnosed, think about the amount of times that you're short on time and you're running through a drive through,
mm,
or that they just have to fend for themselves and with whatever's in the house, or what, you can eat at your friend's house or a relative's house today because you're going over there and we didn't have time to prepare any adequate meals. This is often not an option for these parents, and if it is, it has to be very, very streamlined, very well thought out. And maybe there's only the certain drive through that's 15 miles away from the house that the child can eat the food or will eat the food.
mm.
So I haven't talked a lot about this on a podcast before, but I think it's really important for the public to understand that this is just one layer of stress, food, diet, and dietary preferences for a
Mhm.
younger child, especially, which can cause stress for families.
Thank you for letting us know about that. So, what are some of the additional stressors on a parent with a child with autism spectrum disorder? I understand what the sensitivities are,
Mhm.
or um, like you mentioned, the rigidity, they can only do certain things a certain way, or they have to be on a specific timetable in order to, you know, see them as a specialist. So please add more information, please.
Sure. Yeah, let's jump to a different behavior that can be challenging for parents, and it's right up your alley. Let's talk about communication now,
Yes.
right? Even because um, the way that these kids communicate sometimes, it's almost like a lot of young children, especially, develop sort of like this internal communication system with their primary caregiver. And so the
Mm,
primary caregiver will often tell me, well, I know what that means, or they have this little, gesture or nuance, or, they indicate this, they exhibit this behavior to indicate this is the need, or this is what they're trying to express. And they're so individualized that oftentimes we from the outside don't know what that means. It's not just using their words like most people are conditioned to do. And so this in itself too is very time intensive as far as navigating, being able to understand your child. If this is a new experience for a new parent, it's like, how do I even know what they want? They might be crying a lot, or, throwing those quote unquote proverbial tantrums.
Mhm.
I think everybody will understand that word. I don't love that word, but people know what that looks like for the most part. Try to understand, what the child's trying to communicate or what needs to be met at that
Mhm.
time. And then finally, when parents can catch on to, oh, what, there might be, some speech concerns, and by the time they get assessed and identified and into treatment, you guys take it from there. And then what type of communication will work best, right, for this child at what phase? And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, about how intensive the assessments are, what types of communication systems are available, right?
Yes. Well, thank you for letting me be part of your discussion.
Yeah.
Some of my students would be assessed by a specialized school team for students with autism spectrum disorder. And what they would do is go in and do as much of an assessment as they could based on the child's ability to interact with them. Um, Especially if they were doing a specific activity, then those assessments would take place. So it is time consuming. The team has to get back and discuss with each other what the child is doing, what the child needs. Sometimes it is a communication device, which is really important for their ability to communicate their wants and needs. Other times if they're higher level, it could be working on, like you said, social communication needs, how to problem solve, how to navigate a social situation that they may feel really uncomfortable with. And then, like you've mentioned, they do have particular behaviors. If something doesn't go as planned, so you have to kind of build in those extra activities like a fire drill into their calendar. Otherwise, that could set them off for the rest of the day. So I appreciate what you're saying with parents having to deal not only with the communication, but with like the food sensitivities, just the changes in behavior. So are there resources parents can either learn, or are there specific community services provided for students with autism spectrum disorder?
Yeah. There are, and they're local, and they vary depending on where the person lives. I personally think that early intervention and speech treatment is very valuable for
Yes.
these kids, because that is inherent in the disorder. Part of the disorder to qualify for the diagnosis is communication
Mhm.
issues. And I just want to say a few more things about the timeline for parents when they're looking at your services, right? You're talking about being identified through the school, but there are private speech services too that
Mhm.
parents for outpatient or additional speech services. But the school-based protocols, as you said, they are time consuming. And then, a child may have get a device, and people will say, well, what do those look like? And it could look like anything from something that looks like an iPad
Mhm.
to what we call buttons in our world, just to signal something that, sends sort of a single type of cue to be able, like a yes or no kind of answer.
Mhm.
So these really vary too, and they become, in my experience, highly individualized to the child. So is there a website with just, the communication devices and which one's best for your child? I don't know that would be easy for a parent to look at, as far as that resource, right? And that's why they need qualified speech pathologists. But this
Mhm.
it raises the question, when you're talking about resources in general, how difficult it is for parents to find the right resources that match what their child needs. There are some
Mhm.
general ones like speech therapy. Some kids qualify for occupational therapy, some physical therapy, and some
Mhm.
behavior specialist services. But there is so much information out there, and the internet's kind of a double-edged sword. It's a home to find a lot of things and a lot of information, but yet the quality, the credibility of the information, and then you have a lot of people's different opinions about different resources out there that I find can be a whole nother level of stress for these
Mhm.
parents, because it's very confusing. Who do I
Mhm.
trust? What do I know? This person, and when people's opinions tend to get very passionate online, that
Mhm.
can send a message of deep encouragement or deep fear,
Right.
one way or another. And I think
Mhm.
that's additionally confusing to parents. So, right, parents get
Right.
this momentum, like, oh, here's some resources. I think I finally found some things. And then wait a minute, I just found, 10 other people who say this is awful. I shouldn't do this, or this is great, and I'm confused and I don't know which way to turn. So I think that additional layer of stress for parents, I'm not sure that all parents could necessarily relate to when there's sort of a mainstream protocol for most kids in regular education per se, that don't have a whole lot of special needs and on one or the other end of the continuum to navigate through.
Um, I agree with that. So actually, I identifying a student with autism spectrum disorder, the earlier the better. Totally say that as well. The school district can pick up students from
Mhm,
2.5,
mhm,
3 to 5. Sometimes they can do earlier intervention from birth up until the time they are receiving, a plan of care for that 3 to 5 year old range. Um, but it really also depends on the pediatrician, depends on who is giving the parent advice. There's so many resources, like you said. So I think just going to the Autism Spectrum Disorder website just to get a general idea of what might be needed or what some of the characteristics of autism are, so that the parent can start thinking along that, and start asking those type of questions with
mhm.
their pediatrician or with other family or friends.
The other thing that I would say, as far as parent stressors that kind of go hand in hand with what you're speaking about now, is the discrepancy in opinion
Mhm.
from one parent to the other parent. So if it's a two-parent household, one parent might be very much on board early intervention. Let's look at this. It can't hurt, and the other parent says no. The child's fine. We don't need anything extra or special. And what I would say to these parents is it can't hurt. I would err on the side of caution. Get the child assessed. If there's nothing that's in need of additional assistance, fine. And
Mhm.
if there is, the assistance can be provided sooner than later. And the research
Right.
does show that early intervention for this population is really helpful. So these aren't the days 20, 25 years ago when I was first coming into the field, where there were limited early intervention. Really, I would say there wasn't, in where I live, there wasn't early intervention access that was difficult. It was really just the level of expertise
Mhm.
was a little bit more challenging. Now I think we're a little bit more caught up in general with what to do, what exact skills, how to manage behaviors with auxiliary therapists when these kids do come in. So I parental stress is high, but parental stress between parents is a whole nother layer of
Mm.
stress. And again, if you're out there and you're in a marriage or a committed relationship and co-parenting, you can imagine just the stresses that you have if you don't have a child with special needs. So again, making decisions and being on the same page sometimes is a whole level of stress in itself. And that is tough in our laws here anyway in Pennsylvania. A lot of the treatment, there's different ways that can be granted to treat these kids, whether the parents are not married or whether they are married, or whether they're separated, or, legally divorced and then custody orders. So sometimes that actually can be a barrier if
Mm,
the parents are not on the same page, and one is really seeking treatment and sometimes can't obtain the treatment because the other parent isn't on board. That's not always the case, but it can be. So I really would encourage the adults to step back. And this is where some of the things in the book, my book, come in to be able to manage their own stress, the caregiver stress, and their fears and concerns about why they don't agree on certain interventions, and can they come to some agreement for the best interest of the child. Do they feel well informed with their
mm,
resources? If that's not the case, certainly I can help with that. I do private consulting
mm,
for families to say, look, I think that you're on the right track. You have a lot of these team members involved. These are your experts, and whether they have questions or not, if they're missing something,
mm.
or they need to seek out additional or different providers. So that's one thing I would say, to probably be honest with yourself as an adult and a caregiver, to be on the same page, or to really look what's best for your child, and to leave your own ego at the door, and your perception
Mhm.
about what you think other people might think, because your child comes first. And again, this is very hopeful if the intervention can happen early enough.
Oh, I would totally agree. Early intervention is best. So, how are resolving the stress and how these traditional stress relievers don't always work with these caregivers of children with autism spectrum disorder?
So one of the reasons that I actually put this book together was, I know a lot of people set out and say, "Oh, I want to write a book," and that was really not my intention. Um, it came about because of what the feedback I was hearing from families, and hearing from caregivers, and their frustration about what people, with all the right intentions, were trying to suggest to them to be able
Hmm.
to do to help with their stress levels and relax. And then when I did a formal review of what's out there, I was finding the same things. And so a lot of the recommendations for stress for this population are very similar to basic stress management for the rest of the public. And
Hmm.
so, well, find something that you enjoy. What's your relaxation? What's your go-to? So maybe if you like to exercise, or maybe if you like to take a walk, or maybe find those some friends. Maybe you need away time from your family, and so
Hmm.
have lunch with a friend, or maybe you have a spa day, or you
Hmm.
go for a weekend, or you meditate daily, just to name a few. And a lot of the parents come to me and say, that sounds all well and good, but who has the time? And again, we're all in a little bit of a time crunch these days. But for these parents, the layers of attentiveness that they need toward their child sometimes is really difficult to pass off, to get other help or supervision or babysitting, to be able to really manage their child in a way that they feel is safe, quite frankly. And it's no disrespect to anybody trying to help, but sometimes the needs are so highly specific that it takes a long time to really understand the child. So number one, to have somebody watch your child to do these types of activities to relieve your stress is, up there on the top of caregiver stress.
Oh, sure.
And so that's really one of the harder things that, a lot of the families tell me, yeah, if I had the time, or someone could, watch the child, I could do a lot of these things. And so there's two issues here, right? The one of getting a babysitter or someone to be able to care for the child, and then two, to actually engage in the stress management tactic, whatever it is. And
Mm,
so this was a good time, I thought, to bring my roots in energy psychology to the table, and step up and say, listen, these are rapid stress relieving techniques now that we're seeing that are approved, and we have a lot of research with energy psychology, and they might be the key. So, for those of you out there who don't know what energy psychology techniques are, this is sort of a collective term that we've come up with. It's probably, I don't know, 20, 30 years old. We've kind of been throwing the word around, the term around, but it's gaining more popularity and momentum. but it really does stand for collective, or, it's an umbrella for a lot of techniques that fall underneath it. And there's no one right or wrong technique, but there is a lot of research, clinical research, that's shown really good results, especially with some of the meridian therapies, including emotional freedom techniques, EFT, and thought-filled therapy in the areas of anxiety management, depression,
Mm.
trauma, eating disorders, and addictions. And so I think that some of these techniques are really helpful. They're meant to be rapid. They're shown to be much more rapid than traditional talk therapy. And the beauty of these is they're translatable, they're teachable. So how I use them in practice is I'm on the conservative, and I'm slow and steady wins the race for clinical treatment. So
Mhm.
I start very slow in the conservative manner, as far as not going too quickly, just to see kind of cool magical results happen really fast. But in that process, I like to teach the people that I work with what we're doing, why we're doing it. So they eventually develop this toolbox, and they have the tools to use on their own. And I'm a therapist who, with my caregivers or with my other clients, I still do give homework, because we know now with the neuroplasticity research in the brain that
Mhm.
we can retrain the brain. So practice will help build resilience in the brain away from what we want to move away from, whether it's worry,
Mhm.
anxiety, depression, stress, all those kinds of things. So these techniques are faster. You can do them at home. You don't necessarily need childcare to do them. You can do them at midnight if that's when you want to do
Mhm.
them, or 10 minutes, before your child wakes up at 6 a.m. So I think that they're really effective. They don't necessarily require, the way that I teach it anyway, one, to quiet the mind, as, say, jumping into meditation might. I personally think meditation is an advanced skill. It takes a lot to quiet the mind, to really not have any, and when I'm saying quiet the mind, not any interference. So if I'm just focusing, I'm closing my eyes and focusing on one thing, to not have any intrusive thoughts. So not have, oh, what do
Mhm.
I have to make for dinner? Oh, there's there's a bird. Those
Mhm.
types of intrusive thoughts. So meditation involves prolonged and sustained focus without those intrusive thoughts, and that's really hard, especially for this caregiver whose brain is on hyper alert, right?
Mhm.
And so this is another energetic phenomenon. This comes from polyvagal theory and Stephen Porges's work with fight, flight, and freeze. And I like to talk about this relative to this caregiver population too, that a lot of these parents often develop, especially the primary caregivers,
Mhm.
the mechanism of being on guard, and I have to be ready for a fight. I have to be ready to run, or I have to be ready to just stop what I'm doing and wait something out. So traditionally, fight, flight, and freeze. If we think about the old days and being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, we
Mhm.
had to run for our lives. There was a serious and imminent threat. But for these caregivers, their threat is a safety threat of their child being unsafe. And this is very realistic for this
Mhm.
population, because inherent in the diagnosis, we have behavior challenges, and we have a profound lack of communication oftentimes. So the kids can't understand what might be dangerous. Running across the street, touching a stove, climbing is always fun for a young child, but that can be really dangerous. So these parents have more of an activated, we say amygdala, right? That part of the brain where it's on guard. It has to wait and has to be ready, which is even more difficult if you're in a prolonged state like that, which our brains are not meant to be in a prolonged state. It's going to cause exhaustion, but it's also more difficult to try to shift pretty quickly and try. Let me just try to do some meditation. Well, it's going to be hard, and it almost sets a person up for failure. And then they feel bad about, why can't I do this? This is hard. I don't ever want to meditate or do anything like that again, because it didn't work. And again, I
Mhm.
hear that from my adults who are not caregivers, because just the pace of life today is very fast, and we're tending, especially with I'm going off on a tangent here, but with people over caffeinating, right? It keeps the brain up and very, very high. So it's hard to sort of quiet that when we're trying we sometimes take substances to fall asleep, and then we take them to wake up. That's a little bit unnatural for our brain. So it's hard to make that shift into quieting. So energy psychology techniques I use with these caregivers. There's a couple suggestions in the book for specific exercises. And I do talk a lot about this concept I was just talking about, the fight, flight, and freeze. And I think it's important because a lot of the parents that I've worked with in the past and the current parents that I talk to, they really resonate with this idea of safety. Like, yeah, it's not going to be safe if someone else watches my child. It's not going to be safe if I take that shower for 10 minutes and no one else is in the house. It's just not, I just don't do it. So I think that that's really important for other parents to understand. I'm sure other parents might experience that safety threat at some point, but it may not be as intense, chronic, and prolonged as for these caregivers.
Mhm. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's so important. I can think of a middle school student. He was in a very contained room, self-contained room. And if I looked away briefly, and he ended up, climbing a blackboard that swings.
Uh-huh.
And was wondering like how to get him down safely.
Hmm.
Because I mean, he was just so quick
Hmm.
and managed to get up there. And he did manage to, get down safely. However, it was pretty terrifying at the time for me because I would be responsible for him getting hurt, for example. So, yes. And sometimes this particular student also was in the public school like 2 or 3 days a week, and then he was doing in another school setting that worked primarily with students with autism. So do you have any advice about whether or not the student should be within the school system or in a specialized program to alleviate some of the stress the caregivers may have?
Hmm. I think this is one of the hardest questions to answer because, in my experience, I usually find that the parents have their minds made up one way or another of what their decision is. And I would say to parents who are on the fence to really again consider your child and put your own feelings and emotions aside because your child perceives the world differently than you do,
Mhm.
right? That's true of any child because their developmental worldview is not on par with an adult. I think sometimes, just in general, as parents, we put ourselves in our child's mind and we project how we see the world is how they must see it and have all of the information that we
Mhm.
do to perceive it, and they actually don't. And so, with this subpopulation, I always like to talk about sort of a formulated way of thinking that it makes total sense to me, and it's really been the driver for a lot of my success in my career to think about this population in internalizing and in receiving information and then putting it in a formula, so to speak, in their mind. And we could talk about the Piaget ways of creating schemas and sort of what relates to what, but it's very linear for this population. So let me give you an example of that. And then I think I'll get to your question. I'm going off on a tangent again. But for example, if I say, the grass is green, that gets instilled in my formula. And so if I'm driving, I don't know, on the countryside with family or something, there's a drought and I see brown grass, and I know that grass is green, I would say, what is that? And if my parent might say, "Oh, silly, that's grass. You know that's grass. You know that's grass, but grass is green. Grass is only green."
Mhm.
And so, but it's grass. You know it's grass. It's not grass. It's not grass. Grass is green. That's brown, right? So that would be more information that we might get before the tantrum and the escalation starts because there's a communication gap there. So you can see what happened in this little example. This
Mhm.
is where the child's mind is. Caregiver doesn't recognize it. They
Right.
project on to the child what they think that they know, which doesn't make sense in their formula. And then they keep trying to rationalize it. And it's just the child gets more and more frustrated. So
Mhm.
this is an example of where communication gap, which really is an executive functioning formulary error, can
Mhm.
get in the way and cause a behavior. So when we think about schools and placements, one of the biggest concerns that I've heard from parents is that if my child goes to a specialized school, are they going to pick up behaviors from other kids? And I
Mhm.
want them with kids who have more skills than they have so they can model the correct behaviors. Well, one of the things that I'll say is that modeling isn't that incidental to this population. So, in typically developing brains, um, or young, I don't like that word typical either, but I'm going to say non ASD brains for those young kids, they learn by watching. They do model, and that's how we develop,
Mhm.
aside from having that brain. This brain does not, it's not that easy for them to necessarily model and pick up behaviors. So if your child has modeled behaviors in the past and you see that, right, there's always an exception. So if your child is diagnosed with ASD and they've modeled behaviors in the past to the nth degree, that may be a concern that they might model behaviors elsewhere. And then we'll talk about that.
Mhm.
If you want to have that conversation about going down that path for your child or that placement. But for the most part, if they haven't modeled behaviors to this point, probably not likely, unless it's getting reinforced somehow, that they're going to model them otherwise, for the better or for the worse, right? So that we have to remember that what it makes the biggest difference is inputting the information to create these formulas to create success, and then varying the formulas as needed. And this is where it gets tough, and a lot of kids fly under the radar, and we have hear these terms all the time, high functioning and low
Mhm.
functioning, which I also don't think are that descriptive, because actually I had one of my clients say to me one time, he had been called high functioning his whole life, and he says, I kind of feel like it's a disservice because the expectations then are for me to blend 100%, or more
Mhm.
so than someone who was profoundly affected with the disorder, as we say, and people can just look at the behaviors and say, okay, well, that child definitely falls into this, category of need.
Mhm.
So back to my higher functioning person, what he tends to still struggle with is formula, and that wasn't in the formula. So we're constantly adding to the formula. Okay, now that you've had a new experience, let's add to that formula. So with this generalization, meaning how do I apply a little bit of information to a new situation, is really difficult for this population. And so usually it's an error, it's a mistake, it's an awkward moment, it's not maybe the most effective communication situation, and then we have to come back and talk about it, and then it goes into a formula. So it's very difficult to take all of that information and apply it to the new situation, which, again, going back to school placement, we want to find the people who can invest the time intensity of being able to teach the formulas, who have an idea of recognizing those formulas, and then how do
Mhm.
we build on them. And quite frankly, I see that more in private schools, especially people that are ABA trained, who are licensed as behaviorists, who understand that executive functioning mechanism. So the parents out there, if you're struggling between private or public school or specialized school, because you feel like this might not feel so good for your child, or you really get the information about executive functioning, what's going on, and try to understand how your child learns versus socialization concerns that you might have. And if I speak to socialization concerns, that's another criteria of the diagnosis, that there are
Mhm.
social. So if we think about it, what I say to people is, if you have communication issues and you're not communicating clearly, chances are you're going to have some, snafus with social interactions, which is anytime you communicate, if it's to somebody else, it's a social interaction. So this is kind of why I see, communication and socialization are inherent. that, they're part of one another. And so the socialization piece, with these kids too, and how they think about socialization often isn't how we think about socializing. And I hear
Mhm.
that from parents who have young kids who evidence maybe a lot of what we call parallel play. That means that maybe I'm playing with my trucks and trains here, and Susie's sitting next to me and playing with her trucks and trains. And there's not a whole lot of interaction or engagement, eye contact, back and forth, interactive play. But if I'm the ASD kid, I might be perfectly content with that. That might be great for what I perceive as successful socialization. So
Mhm.
that's just one example. But as kids get older, they do perceive their social satisfaction much differently than I think that their parents project what they deem successful social satisfaction. So I think that's always something good to check in with your kid about. Like, are you happy? Is this your friend? They might think their best friend is somebody that they see once a month and just go to a play area with for a half an hour. And if you ask the kid if they're satisfied with that, they might say, yeah, it's great. The parent might say, oh, that's only like one kid, 30 minutes a month. I don't think that's enough. But the child might be happy. So you may want to expose them to more kids or more social to get the practice. But as far as their personal satisfaction, I think most parents are going to find as your child ages, their satisfaction levels are going to be much different than what you perceive that they should be.
And I think that's the hardest thing about being a parent or a caregiver of a child with autism spectrum disorder, because you have to you have to start thinking like them
Mhm.
and see it from their perspective. And I know it's hard because we all have our own, um, like you said, our own scheme of how things need to work. And if someone isn't doing that really successfully, we think we have to make them be able to do it, um, just so that without giving thought, I guess, to what's really going on with the child.
Mhm. Yeah,
Um,
and so for parents who have kids that aren't diagnosed, the things that you might put yourself in your kids' shoes about is maybe like, oh yeah, I know they don't like peas. I know that when they come home from soccer practice, they're just going to throw all their stuff down. That's their pattern, right? So these parents, again, to take it up notches of intensity, it's almost every move the child makes, you have to predict what that formula is going to be like, and especially if the child might be unsafe. So I just want to go back to behaviors for a minute and talk about those intensities too. The behaviors, by the time that families get to me to manage behaviors, I say to them, this is not something you probably could have managed with your own expertise if it's not a whole lot on your own, because behaviors can serve multiple functions, we call them, or purposes. And when there starts to be more than one purpose or function in one
mm,
behavior, that's when it gets really challenging. And that's also why sometimes what we would deem aggressive, observably aggressive types behaviors that can come out of nowhere.
mm,
Right. So I remember
mm,
thinking about your experience with the blackboard that you just talked about. This was well before I was in the field. I was a youngster, and I remember being at a carnival, and they had those old Ferris wheels. I don't know if they still have them. Look at the light bulbs on them on the
mm,
sides. They lit up at night, and there were like the bulbs on every strand of metal. And it was back then. It was Special Needs Day, which I don't think that they use that term anymore, but that's what they called it back then. And there were just these young people on the Ferris wheel, and it stopped, just to put the next person on. And I remember seeing this one of the cars sort of swinging at the top, and kids do that, right? They swing them
mm.
back and forth. But I don't know why I honed in on that kid, and I watched him stand up. He got out of the car. It was the top, and he literally just grabbed on and slid down, and you could see all the lights popping. They weren't on. It was the daylight, but you could see them all popping, and you could hear them. And he slid the whole way down to the bottom and just walked away. Like, I wanted to get, so I don't
Mm,
know, obviously, if that person was diagnosed or not, but it does, let me segue one more time, that ASD wasn't diagnosed a whole lot back then.
Mhm.
So what we were calling it, was mental retardation. But if you look back at old footage, at old videos, you can see a lot of behavioral demonstrations that look like what we might call ASD today. So I don't know what impairments that person had, but they walked away. They weren't escalated, weren't crying, just walked away as if I wanted down and I got down. So nobody probably could have predicted that this person was going to do that. Obviously, if there was a fear or there was some safety issue in the past, he wouldn't have been allowed, the caregiver with him would have not permitted him to be on there.
Right.
So that's just an example. And then the hyper and then the hyposensitivities to pain. Like anybody else doing that would have been like probably screaming because his hands were all cut up from all of that glass. And he walked away and didn't have any expression on his face. So sometimes this diagnosis, goes hand in hand again with that different neurology, that they don't perceive pain in the same ways that we do. Either they don't feel it much at all, or they feel the slightest sensitivity. So my point of that story is again to bring it back to no matter how good of a job a parent's doing, and this is why that safety hyper awareness develops, that you can turn your back for a second, 2 seconds. You don't know what that child's decision is going to be, that they might be unsafe at any given moment.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That seemed really amazing that young man was able to get down by just sliding down the metal rail. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And like you
And
say, not expressing pain with all the cuts that he was receiving from the light bulbs.
and so I want to take the other side of this. Now that we've talked a lot about the stressors, again, the hopefulness in this is that I encourage families to seek treatment. And again, they might say to me sometimes, well, I don't know that I have an hour a week to come to outpatient therapy. And I really encourage them, especially with energy practitioners. I say we can make it worth your while because they are fast tools. It might be just a few hours of investment, but this will carry you in the long term for the most part. And you don't
Hmm.
have to, and you don't have to take these hours and hours out of your day to regularly engage in these types of practices if you don't have it. I mean, it would be great if you lived in a world that you could, but realistically, there is a time constraint. So the other things that I talk about in the book is you asked earlier about resources. Find a good team. If you need help with finding a good team, start with autism reputable websites, your county, whatever county that you live in, especially in the U.S. You can look for county resources and social work, social services. Start from there. Call a case manager, and they'll say, "Listen, I have a child with ASD. I'm looking for what's available." They'll be able to point you in the right direction to
Hmm.
community-based services that are available in your area. Sometimes they're covered through insurance. Oftentimes they are. When you get into some private and some private pay things, they, depending on the specialization of service, they might not be covered, but you can always start with general local things. In our state, the child can qualify for state assistance, which then most of the services are covered 100%. So there is funding, there are resources available. I encourage families to reach out on the behavior end and on the supports for the child end, because once you start to feel confident that the child's making progress and they're getting the right services that they need to develop appropriately
Hmm.
or as appropriately for their person, you're going to feel better as a parent. And then for your own self-care, energy psychology techniques, I think are the way to go. They're rapid relief. You can use them at home. You don't have to have a lot of time engaged in them. And then I also ask parents to just be honest with themselves. Again, what are their fears? What are their concerns? Talk to, if there's another co-parent or a spouse involved, you know, can we, again, I'm going to say again, check our egos at the door and, move forward with what's best for the child. You're not alone. This is, I can't remember the statistic. I think the last CDC citation was 1 in 54, something around that. And again, that last study was very small, it was a very small sample. But what we do know is, the numbers are staggering. They're worldwide. Autism doesn't discriminate.
Mm.
So you're not alone. There are many parents that are on this journey, and chances are you know someone who whose child has a diagnosis, but you just may not know it. So early intervention and honesty with what you can provide your child and what they need.
Well, awesome. I was just going to ask you for three um, takeaways, but I think you've just mentioned them. So we could move on from there. Um, so how can parents who are caregivers of a child with autism spectrum disorder get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my website is my name. It's mandifreger.com, and there's a contact page on there. I am licensed in Pennsylvania. I'm a licensed professional counselor. And so I accept insurance in Pennsylvania, and I do consulting work outside of the state. And the consulting work is different than direct treatment because I can relatively quickly assimilate what you have, what services you have going on. And if you have any questions, like I mentioned earlier about, am I on the right path? Is this what's supposed to be happening?
Mhm.
Another common question I usually get is, how long should this take before I see some results? And that's always a hard question to answer because everybody,
Yes.
I'm never going to tell you in 3 days or in 6 weeks. But
Why
that's a
not,
hard one,
Mandy? Come
right?
on.
Right. That's a hard one. But even with specialized behavior programs, it
Mhm.
just depends on the behavior specialist. It depends on how intense the intervention is. And that's, I think, what parents have the most question. We've been doing this behavior intervention for X X amount of days, X amount of months. Should we be seeing some change by now? And is the behavior specialist really well versed in functions of behavior, and are they really reassessing the plan? I mean, they have to be, the goals constantly have to be revisited. I know we want to have goals because the insurance company or the governing bodies tells us we have to, but really goals should be the meat and potatoes of really your focus and what you're
Mhm.
doing. It really should be practical, usable, and we should be looking at them frequently, not just kind of going off and doing the same thing and then, oh yeah, what's the goal? That happens a lot in behavior treatment. So we want to be really actively goal focused. And if we are, and there's not something changing there. There's either something with the reinforcement protocols that you would want to look at, the child's motivation, or are we missing something as the treatment clinicians? So those are the types of things that consultation I can be supportive with. I do tend to be a little bit more definitive, I think, than a lot of therapists, because I think in today's day and age, there's, because we're so inundated with resources,
Mhm.
people aren't being told a hard yes or no. And we crave some of that structure and some of that definitiveness. So I will be as clear as I can as far as interventions go and what I think is going on and what we need to explore versus, well, you kind of just have to pick what you want to do. I think that's becoming really frustrating, even in
Mhm.
mainstream medical care.
Mhm.
I some things. It's up to you. It's patient centered. It's patient choice. I get it, but as patients, we're not always the experts, and sometimes we need somebody just to instill a little bit of confidence to move in one direction or another. I experienced that really early on when I started working in this field. I would get that from my peers. Well, you could do this, you could do that. Well, how do I know what to do? How do I know how long to do it? So I tend to be a little bit more directive in my consulting, and even with some of the counseling practices with caregivers.
Mhm.
But I think caregivers inherently, when they start to listen to themselves, they have the answer, when they can put the ego aside and honestly, dig deep and really um, be honest about what's best for their child. They have the answers. They just need someone to bring that to their attention, I think. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I know um, it is hard for parents to figure out what treatment their child should have. Um, I also saw a student who was on the higher level of autism, I would say. And I sat in his educational meeting and I noticed that the word autism was never mentioned. And the special ed teacher was saying that mom had made an appointment to have her son evaluated, but then canceled it. And the special ed teacher felt like the parent felt guilty because her job involved her being out of state a lot. So we could not call it autism, we could call it anything else. And yet still put in the treatment that the student wanted. But so that's the opposite extreme of what we've been talking about. So
Yeah.
you have it's kind of frustrating when you want to help and you can't recommend services out somewhere.
This to any parents out there who might feel like this parent did, that I feel guilty, or I don't like that word, and I really want to avoid that because for some reason that again feels yucky to me. I work with a lot of adults who are well into adulthood, and again, these age demographics, millennials, X's, missed a lot of these early diagnoses and kind of went under the radar. And a lot of them are getting diagnosed a little bit later in life, which a lot of clinicians have a little bit of debate about because it's like, I don't know your developmental history. But I will tell you, when they receive the diagnosis, they will all say to me, it's a sigh of relief. I knew I was different. I knew I was struggling. I'd never got the help that I needed. It always felt hard for me in social interactions. I was bullied, whatever. They mostly are relieved. So if this speaks anything to parents that, maybe later on in life, there will be some sort of identification for the child and they'll understand it. Again, remember they think in formulas. And even I do this with my young kids when I get them. We're talking about the language, we're talking about the diagnosis. A lot of them, I want to shout it from the rooftops. I have autism. And sometimes I'll say, well, maybe you don't want to say it in this situation or the first thing, it's not completely. So I do think that there is some satisfaction for many individuals in being able to identify with a label, so to speak, about how their brain works and why there's been a missing piece, or they felt like there's been a missing intangible piece all these years. I know we're in a society now that wants to move away from labels, but again, formulary thinking, sometimes a label breeds comfort.
Thank you for that. So with your book, can you tell us a little bit more about it and how caregivers with children with autism spectrum disorder can find it so that they could get some of your great advice that you've shared with us today?
Yeah, it will be coming out hopefully by the end of the year. I have a whole page on my website. It's mandifreger.com. And there's a book page there. You'll be able to order it eventually through there. But the book covers, there's a lot of little, is it like a summary, on the book page that people can look at. But there's a history really of my journey through ABA and what I saw as some of the pitfalls in being able to gain the skill portion for parents and for this population. And then I talk about the willingness and all these feelings that parents have and how to navigate some of those feelings and how to be honest with them and how to acknowledge them. Like some of the skills that you might have been referring to with this woman, I think parents go through the gamut of the emotions, and sometimes it doesn't feel comfortable to share them because there is a lot of guilt or shame or even embarrassment, and we don't feel like that's socially appropriate to have to want to feel like that about our child. But the reality is we're human and we're going to have a range of human emotions. So I talk about that on the willingness, and then I talk about the energy fields and how collectively when parents do the best that they can with their skill set and with their managing their emotions, that their energy field overall becomes better, the interactions with the child becomes better, and life can be easier and enjoyable. It's the one word we haven't used today, but this can be enjoyable. And I think more and more parents are coming out and saying, hey, you know what, I enjoy my child, diagnosis or not, and that's the goal, and that is the end goal. So I hope this book can help parents really relate to a lot of the things that I've heard and learned from the parents that I've worked with through the years. Be able to acknowledge their own feelings and then be able to get the tools or at least a good start on knowing what they didn't know on how to get those tools that they need for themselves.
Oh, that's really profound. Thank you so much for being here today. Mandi, I really appreciate all this wealth of information that we've shared with parents who are caregivers with a child with autism spectrum disorder. Thank you so much.
It's great to be here. I hope some people got something out of this and will be able to move forward in a happier life.
Yes, definitely. And with your book and with your resources, they will. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Caregiver Cast today. Get a community of support, resources, and strategies for your caregiving journey inside the Caregiver Lifeline community. Visit caregiverlifelinecommunity.com. Get involved with the show. Send your email to mpetrucci2002@gmail.com. And we'll see you again next week for another episode of Caregiver Cast.